and welcome to the Modern Context Podcast. I'm your host, Yasmin Aliyah Khan, and I'm so happy that you're here. If you're back, thanks for coming back, and if it's your first time, I'm very glad to have you. Wow, what a start to the new year it's been. You may have noticed that there wasn't an episode 2 weeks ago when there should have been an episode, but I was not feeling well. I feel like I was sick in the most recent episode too, but between that last episode and this one, I don't know, something got me. And it stayed with me for a while. The original plan was that I was just going to release an episode a little bit later than usual, but then that flex deadline came and went too, and I still wasn't feeling any better, so I figured, let me just rest, kick this thing, and get on with it from that point. It wasn't COVID, by the way, but I was running a fever, and I had a pretty bad headache, and I had a cough. I don't know if you can tell, but my voice still is a little bit off. I sound like I just woke up all the time, but I promise I've been up for a very long time. It's not great when you've got an incessant tickle in your throat and your job requires you to just talk all the time, but I've gotten pretty good at muting myself on live shows whenever I'm coughing. Meanwhile, podcasts like this one are pre-recorded and edited, so don't worry, I'm not going to cough in your headphones at any point in this episode. So here we are, a month into 2024, an election year here in the US. We're in the middle of caucus and primary season, and the frontrunner for president on the Republican side is currently engaged in several significant legal battles all at once. There's admittedly a lot of meat there, and yes, I almost can't bring myself to talk about it here. I mean, I cover those topics in my work that I do with the Young Turks, but here, it's really hard to motivate yourselves to talk about a presidential race that, one, I already watched 4 years ago, and two, is between two candidates who, let's say, are less than inspiring. In 2020, the election was grim, and in 2024, it is far more grim. And it also speaks to a strange stagnancy in our country right now. So much has happened over the past 3 or 4 years, and yet somehow it feels like all of us are just desperately clinging onto the past, at least onto that which is familiar. The election of Joe Biden could arguably be seen as Americans clinging on to the Obama years, the pre-Trump, pre-pandemic years when the world was just very different. The fact that this is Trump's third time in recent years running for president is exhausting for everyone, but his base seems not just unwilling, but unable to let him go. They don't know how to give him up even if they wanted to. The United States is an interesting case study, though. We're so large, so spread out, and so isolated that a lot of what we see in the news hardly touches us personally. Maybe that's why conspiracy theories are so easily spread around here. It's easy to deny what happens in the outside world when you just live and exist in a small bubble where you don't actually see or experience much of the actual world. It's totally plausible, for example, that you might be afraid of Muslim people even though you have never actually met a Muslim person. Or it's plausible that despite millions of Americans dying from COVID in 2020 and 2021, you don't personally know anyone who died from it. And perhaps this is why Americans seem, at least anecdotally, less interested and less informed about what goes on in the world outside of our borders. Whatever's outside of these borders, whatever's on the other side of these two massive oceans flanking us, it's just too far out of our bubbles for us to comprehend, let alone care about. But as far as I'm concerned, none of that is any excuse to shut one's eyes to what's going on in the rest of the world as if it doesn't involve or affect us here. The truth of it is that very little goes on in the rest of the world that the US isn't directly involved in or affected by. So with that, let's talk about what's going on in Ecuador. Ecuador, as you can probably discern from the name, is located along the equator on the Pacific coast of South America. I've never been, but it's supposed to be very beautiful. It's incredibly diverse in terms of its wildlife and plant life, so much so that Charles Darwin himself did a lot of his research down there. Ecuador is bordered by Colombia to its north and Peru to its south and east, and it's got the Pacific Ocean on its western coast. The Andes Mountains run straight through the middle of the country, and the Galapagos Islands belong to Ecuador. Ecuador has two notable cities. There's Guayaquil, the port city and the largest city in the country, and then there's Quito, which is the capital, but it's located high in the Andes Mountains, so it's a little bit difficult to access. In 2019, when protests overran the capital city, the government was temporarily moved to Guayaquil. Major industries in Ecuador are bananas, tourism, petroleum, shrimp, gold, coffee, and cacao. Panama hats actually came from Ecuador back in the day, but they got their name because the workers used to wear them while they were building the Panama Canal. Of course, one of Ecuador's most significant unofficial exports is cocaine, but we will get to that later. The vast majority, a little more than 70% of Ecuadorians, are mestizo, which is people with mixed indigenous and European backgrounds. The people who live in the mountains actually still speak their indigenous language, but the country's official language, like most of the rest of South America, is Spanish. Up until recently, Ecuador was a quiet country, one of the safest countries in South America. It was an oasis of peace, caught between a chaotic drug trade that had engulfed its neighbors. But as international relationships shifted, the drug trade itself shifted into Ecuador. Today, Ecuador is a battleground, with the government at war with the drug cartels for control of the country. To really get a grasp on how we got here, I think it's always helpful to go back into a country's history a little bit. I'll try not to get too carried away, so long story short, the indigenous people were there until the Incas of Peru took over Ecuador in the 15th century. The following century, however, the Spanish arrived, toppling Incan leadership and bringing with them their Spanish language, Catholicism, and disease. Spain would rule the land for a few centuries, and Ecuador would finally gain its independence in 1830. And I think at this point, it's safe to just skip over all of the 1900s and head straight into the modern era, the 21st century. In the year 2000, under President Gustavo Naboa, Ecuador adopted the US dollar as its national currency. This is directly relevant to the trouble we are seeing today in Ecuador over 20 years later. So why did Ecuador choose to dollarize its economy? It was a controversial move at the time, but back then Ecuador was dealing with 100% inflation. That is insane and absolutely unsustainable for any government or nation. It also wasn't a new problem for Ecuador. They had been having problems with inflation for years already, and as I said, that kind of inflation is really unsustainable. A big part of the reason why this was happening was because the Central Bank of Ecuador kept printing money. More money to purchase the same number of goods results in rampant inflation. Also, in Ecuador, unlike the United States, the federal bank was not independent from its central government. This means that the government would be able to, for example, gain political favor against the masses by ramping up spending and implementing a burst of economic prosperity, but then the results would be short-lived and artificial, as they would only be contributing to the long-term inflationary problem. Fed up and unable to rein in the central bank, Ecuador decided to just use US dollars instead. They struck a deal with the US Federal Reserve to get dollars from them. The Fed would put US dollars into Ecuadorian banks and ATMs, and over time, the old currency would be completely supplanted by the US dollar. Now, Ecuador is no longer able to print its own money, which arguably leads to more government transparency when it comes to government spending. For example, if printing money is no longer an option, and a president wants to increase government spending in a certain area, they'd have to raise the money through fiscal policies like taxation. It's much harder to hide taxation from the public than it is to hide printing money. Of course, the downside to that is that the government has fewer options available to it in terms of its own economy. When some governments might print money during a recession, Ecuador no longer has that option. In exchange for all of these American dollars, because Ecuador couldn't just afford to buy dollars, they would have to sell goods to the US, specifically bananas, chocolate, and oil. That means that they're exporting more than they're importing. Bananas, chocolate, and oil are all leaving the country rather than staying in Ecuador. Conveniently, Ecuador has vibrant coastal port cities that allow for this type of exportation. And overall, this has helped to stabilize the Ecuadorian economy. Inflation calmed down, and for a time, the country was one of the most peaceful in all of South America. However, this dollarization would also lead to the cartel-related violence plaguing Ecuador today. Because Ecuador uses a foreign currency, money is more easily laundered there, making it an attractive company for gangs to conduct their illicit business operations. Jump ahead a few years to 2007, and we've got President Raphael Correa. Correa was a democratic socialist, a leftist, and he was the first president in a while to last longer than a couple of years. He actually ended up serving for about 10 years as president. He had humble beginnings, but he was able to get a good education through scholarship programs. He became an economist studying globalization and its effects on the developing world. He became Ecuador's finance minister in 2005, and by 2007, he had been elected president. As you can expect with a leftist president, he invested heavily in social programs from the get-go. He spent over $2 billion within a year of being elected on schools, hospitals, and housing. This helped to dramatically reduce poverty and inequality, and the natural result of that is that crime goes down. The murder rate in Ecuador went down to historically low levels. Gang violence was also curtailed as Correa was able to transition gangs into state-backed youth groups. He also implemented some antitrust policies, with the government seizing some large companies that were owned by rich, powerful, and corrupt families. At this point, the world was entering into a global economic crisis. We all remember 2008, especially us millennials. Ecuador, as you know, had tied its economy to the US economy with the adoption of the dollar. Ecuador was also beholden to the US economy as it needed to export oil to raise oil profits. But in 2008, amidst the crisis, oil revenue was down, and Correa announced that Ecuador would default on its interest payment on foreign debt, a $30 million debt, as a matter of principle. During his time in office, he also cut diplomatic ties with Ecuador's neighbor, Colombia, and he refused to renew a lease for the American military base in Ecuador. Now, there's a lot of legitimate reasons for a country to not want to host an American military base, but in Ecuador, that base patrolled Ecuadorian ports and waters, and it helped prevent narcotics trafficking through Ecuador's ports. He also cut ties with the American International Narcotics Agency. Over the years, Correa began consolidating power. He briefly lost control of the military and police units when he cut their government benefits, but once things calmed down, he was able to get back to work. He reformed, let's say, the judicial system, but according to Human Rights Watch, his government, quote, pressured and intimidated judges and fired some who stood up to them. There were allegations of Correa's officials calling judges to influence them to rule in one way or another, and there were leaked emails in which government officials ordered judges to throw out any cases against the government. He also formed a commission to regulate media content, introducing a measure prohibiting media outlets from promoting or favoring any political candidate, proposal, or ideology. In 2012, the New York Times said, quote, President Raphael Correa of Ecuador is leading a relentless campaign against free speech. Correa said, quote, media cannot be political actors. We have to put an end to the illegitimate, immoral political power that certain media have. All they do every day is political campaign against the government. It was also under Correa's government that WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange was famously granted political asylum in Ecuador. And it was under Correa's government that Ecuadorian land was being sold off to China in secret. Once the public found out, after his re-election, his popularity started to dwindle. He had essentially lied to his people. He had been building up a fund with international support and money, we're talking billions of dollars, to prevent oil drilling in the national park, but secretly he was allowing the Chinese to drill in those national parks. The people tried to have a national referendum on the matter, but they were denied, and the Chinese were ultimately allowed to drill in that park. And then more government spending cuts came. Oil revenue was still down, and remember how the government can't just print money when it needs cash anymore? Well, Correa attempted to implement a 77% inheritance tax on the people to raise more money, but after numerous public protests, the tax was killed. He also removed term limits from the presidency around this time, even though he didn't plan to run for re-election when his term was up in 2017. Still, with no term limits, the plan was that he'd be able to seek re-election at a later time if he wanted to. So a promising president turned out to be not so great, but Correa did one thing that specifically contributed to the situation in Ecuador today. He dramatically reduced the number of homicides in Ecuador while he was president, but He did so by doubling the prison population. In doing this, he basically concentrated gang members in bases and gave them access to other gang members and disaffected youth and citizens. He basically created gang recruitment centers, a crime base within the nation's prison system. Now, towards the end of Correa's presidency, things took an important and significant turn. Bordered by both Peru and Colombia, the two largest cocaine producers in the world, Ecuador had always managed to stay out of trouble in relation to the drug cartels, even though the cartels would often traffic drugs through Ecuador. At the time, the cocaine trade was being run by the FARC, a Colombian guerrilla group that had been at odds with the Colombian government for decades. But by 2016, the FARC disbanded after signing a ceasefire deal. The deal was a long time coming and it was a celebrated event, but now, without the FARC in control, it left a power vacuum in the cocaine trade. Around the same time, demand for cocaine boomed in Europe. Cocaine heading to Europe would be moved on ships, so whoever wanted to profit from the cocaine trade would have to have control of the ports. Also, the pandemic of 2020 led to a backlog of product contributing to the spiked demand. With this power vacuum, combined with the increased post-pandemic demand for product, various gangs were left fighting for control of drug trafficking routes running through Ecuador. The Ecuadorian port city of Guayaquil also became a critical point of control. The combined result of all of this was that Ecuador became ground zero for the international cocaine trade practically overnight. This conflict would erupt in 2024. But before we talk too much about 2024, let's go back to 2017. As Correa saw his popularity waning, even though he'd eliminated term limits, he decided to lay low for a while and install his vice president as the new president. Lenin Moreno became president of Ecuador in 2018 with the backing of Correa in a contested election. However, once in office, Moreno broke with his former associate and began reversing some of Correa's policies. For instance, he reinstated term limits for the president, barring Correa from running again in the future. Correa is actually in exile in Europe right now, because if he goes back to Ecuador, he'll be arrested, but that's a whole other story. Anyway, so Moreno is in office now and the prisons are stacked. Moreno, naturally, decides to slash the prison budgets and essentially dismantle the security system, which was comprised of police and intelligence, the judicial system, which managed the prisons, and the National Council for the Control of Narcotic and Psychotropic Substances. As a direct result of all of this, Ecuador went from being one of the most peaceful countries in South America to the most violent. He also supported oil drilling in the Ecuadorian Amazon, and he allowed the U.S. military to use the Galapagos Islands as a military airbase. And this upset all kinds of people around the world, including environmentalists and indigenous groups. The Galapagos Islands are known and have been celebrated around the world for their incredible biodiversity, and the idea of having a military base there is horrendous. And it was under Moreno's government that Ecuador made international headlines as its people flooded the streets in protest in 2019. The Moreno government was forced to move its operations from the capital city of Quito to the port city of Guayaquil. The protests were triggered when, facing a massive national debt, Moreno announced the abolition of fuel subsidies. This resulted in diesel fuel prices increasing by 50% and regular fuel prices increasing by 30%. His approval ratings dropped during this time from 80% to 30%. The protests lasted for 11 days, with transportation workers bringing the capital to a literal standstill, blocking major roads and bridges within Quito. Within days, students and indigenous groups became involved in the protest. The capital was shut down and temporarily moved. Protesters overtook oil fields and shut them down. Eventually, national police would begin using tear gas against protesters. Next thing you know, protesters were attacking the police with rockets and stones and Molotov cocktails. And by October 14th, the subsidies came back. In 2021, during Moreno's last year in office, Ecuador saw a prison massacre, one of the worst in Ecuador's history. Moreno had dismantled the security measures that had been in place, and he had eliminated many of the public workers who ran the prison system. All of this, combined with the bloated prison systems, contributed to the February massacre in which 116 people were killed. But that wasn't the only prison massacre. During that time, an estimated 240 people would be killed in prison massacres in Ecuador. Ecuador had 65 prisons across the country, and they were all stuffed beyond capacity. They only had about half as many prison security guards as they would have needed to control that large of a prison population. Within that prison population, an estimated 15% had never been sentenced. Conditions like that can predictably lead to radicalization, especially when you've locked up gang members in those prisons who have nothing better to do than to look for fresh recruits. The national prison system became the de facto command center for gang operations. And during all of this, the drug trade from Colombia was finding its way into Ecuador and into the prison systems. Moving on, Moreno's successor Guillermo Lasso took over in 2021, furthering the country's shift to the political right. He declared that all cartel members were terrorists. Also, seeing the increased gang violence and cartel activity, he allowed civilians access to guns for their own protection. Following a prison riot that killed, some of them by beheading, over 120 inmates that September, Lasso declared a state of emergency in Ecuador. But Lasso had troubles of his own. He was named in the leaked Panama Papers, where it was found that he had hidden offshore assets, and his people tried to impeach him over it. He was also sued by Amazonian Ecuadorians over his plans to drill and mine untouched and incredibly biodiverse regions of the rainforest. He called another state of emergency in October of 2021, this time related to increased drug and cartel-related violence in the country. But this spike in crime was very much related to those prison riots from the month prior. The following year, in 2022, fuel and food prices began to increase, and just like the last time fuel prices went up, the people took to the streets in protest. Lasso's response was to unleash the national police on protesters and limit social media and media communications, and this resulted in a second attempt to impeach him. By 2023, Lasso announced, without any kind of vote or debate or parliamentary approval, that civilians would be able to carry weapons in the streets. He said that this was for their own protection from cartel violence, but the people weren't actually a fan of this decree. I know as Americans this might be hard to comprehend, but they were concerned that more guns would simply result in more violence, and they were worried about the formation of militant groups. Also in 2023, he was actually about to get impeached for embezzlement, but before he could actually be impeached, he dissolved the National Assembly and triggered a snap election. Interestingly, he announced that he would not be running for re-election in the snap election. Just a few months later, in October, Daniel Naboa was elected president of Ecuador. Daniel Naboa is the son of the wealthiest man in Ecuador. He's the heir to a banana empire, he's relatively inexperienced, and he's incredibly young. He's only 35 years old. He's the world's youngest democratically elected head of state. He was inaugurated in November of 2023, and now he's president during one of the deadliest times in Ecuador's history. The country has no control of its prisons, and the cartels have all but taken over the nation's highways and ports. How will Naboa manage the situation before him? His plan was to militarize the ports and customs. He wanted to house violent inmates in offshore prisons, and he wanted to invest in more military weaponry and national intelligence. He wants to reduce the national debt, focus on education and unemployment, and return peace to the country. So good, he had a plan. But then, in January 2024, things got even worse in Ecuador. The leader of one of the biggest gangs in the country busted out of maximum security prison. The gangs took over the country. The breakout triggered riots in prisons across the country. Gang members stormed the news station while it was doing a live broadcast and took hostages live on air. They stormed hospitals, schools, and businesses. They took prison guards hostage, kidnapped and murdered them. They detonated bombs, and Naboa declared a state of national emergency for 60 days, suspending citizens' rights and mobilizing the military within the prisons. Today, Ecuador's very green and very young president is faced with an unimaginable challenge. He's literally fighting for control of his nation and government, And he's only been doing this for a couple of months. The scary truth of the matter is that the cartels are seemingly organized against the government. And without the formal constraints governments face when implementing initiatives, the cartels can take action more quickly and more effectively than the government can. Prior to all of this, Naboa has said that he would like to tackle crime in a similar way to what President Bukele of El Salvador is doing. He wanted to build more prisons. Now, arguably, more prisons and more inmates in those prisons contributed to this problem in the first place. And the national government of Ecuador has already lost control of those prisons a long time ago, long before Naboa took office and long before the most recent wave of prison riots. Bukele's government also isn't perfect. It's repeatedly being flagged by international organizations for human rights violations, but Bukele justifies his actions and policies by pointing to El Salvador's dramatically reduced violence and murder rates. Also, mobilizing the military in this situation is tricky. For one, members of the military, the prison security system, and the government are corrupt and working with the cartels. Additionally, increased militarization tends to more endanger civilian populations and escalate the violence. Now, Naboa has recently announced that he will be gradually reducing fuel subsidies, and we remember what happened the last time a president tried to cut fuel subsidies. It wasn't good. Maybe Naboa is hoping that his people are too scared of gang violence to actually come out and protest against the subsidies like they did in 2019, but he's emphasizing that the reduction will be progressive as to not shock the economy. Either way, Naboa has few options. Remember, Ecuador does not have the ability to print money, so when it needs money, they have to find a way to raise it. Naboa needs money if he's going to launch a military campaign against the cartels. He's also exploring tax reforms to bring more money in. And for its part, the US is providing Ecuador with aid during this time, but overall there's a lack of any kind of long-term strategy. Naboa seems to have plans for what he would like to do, but there's no telling when he'll actually be able to implement any of those plans. The immediate goal right now is focused on quieting the unrest and regaining control of the country. But in the long run, the government will have to find a way to actually quell the international drug trade. And that is much, much, much easier said than done. All right, that is it for episode 12 of the Modern Context podcast. This was a long one. This was maybe one of the longer ones that I'd done, but I really hope you got something out of it. Happy February, and until next time, we would love to hear from you. Reach out to the show at hello@modconpod.com with any suggestions or questions you might have for us. Also, don't forget to follow and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. Find us on YouTube and tell your friends about us. And of course, thank you for listening. I can't wait to see y'all next time. Cheers.